Thank you, Mr. Chair and fellow panelists, as well as the distinguished members at this table. Mr. Chair, Excellencies, delegates, representatives of Indigenous nations and peoples in the room, Sego, Soagwego, Gawaniyosta Nyungyats. My name is Karla General, and my Mohawk name is Gawaniyosta, which means she brings good words. The Deputy High Commissioner this morning quoted the work of my great-grandfather. And I think we can ask the same question today of this body, 94 years later. Do you really believe that all peoples are entitled to equal protection of international law? Indigenous peoples around the world deserve an answer, an affirmative answer, and one that is met with action. It is such an honor to have the opportunity to address you today. It is actually quite remarkable. My great-grandfather was here in Geneva almost 100 years ago and attempted to do the same, but he was not allowed to address the League of Nations directly at that time. We have come a long way since those dark times. In 2007, after 30 years of debate, the United Nations adopted its Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Adoption of the Declaration was a historic achievement and the most significant development in international human rights law in decades. And yet, we have many challenges ahead, because it is also remarkable that in 2017, almost a century after Deskahe first attempted to address the world community, that authentic and representative Indigenous voices are still denied access to the United Nations. This Council and other UN bodies recognize that their existing rules of participation generally do not permit the participation of Indigenous peoples' governments at the UN as such, unless they are able to acquire consultative status as non-governmental organizations. But Indigenous peoples' governments are not NGOs, and they are not civil society. To address this implementation gap, in 2014, member states committed at the World Conference on Indigenous Peoples to consider ways to enable the participation of Indigenous peoples' representative institutions at the UN. After almost 2 years of consultations among Indigenous peoples, member states, and UN bodies, and months of intergovernmental negotiations this summer, member states failed to reach consensus on a substantive resolution. On September 8th, the General Assembly adopted a compromise resolution that simply encourages other UN bodies to enhance participation, such as this Council, but delays a potential substantive decision in the General Assembly until its 75th session, and once again deliberately denies the opportunity for Indigenous governments to participate in matters affecting their interests at the international level. This is the most pressing issue of our time. Without authentic Indigenous voices, decisions made in international forums will not be responsive to the lived realities of Indigenous peoples at home. If Indigenous voices continue to be left out of decision-making, the most horrific rights violations of our times will continue. The killings of land defenders and human rights activists, the land grabs and the rush for natural resources, the epidemic levels of violence against and trafficking of women and children, the movement of extractive industry to Indigenous lands, and continued destruction of our cultural ways of living. And even when a domestic legal victory is achieved, its impact can be limited because our rights are not always guaranteed when the rule of law does not exist for Indigenous peoples. It is morally reprehensible that killings of Indigenous peoples continue to occur and go on unprosecuted. Last year, as reported by the Special Rapporteur on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, 281 human rights defenders were murdered in 25 countries, more than double the number in 2014. Half of them were working to defend their land rights, Indigenous and environmental rights. If Indigenous peoples had a voice at the UN, they could tell you themselves that their situation has improved very little in the 10 years since adoption of the Declaration, because decisions continue to be made without the benefit of their views and experiences. This has to change, and we collectively are in a position to help make that change. When Indigenous voices are heard, debate and dialogue are strengthened, and proposed solutions are more responsive and more effective. Our Indigenous youth have a significant role to play in this work. They are citizens of the world and citizens of our tribal nations, and they have much to contribute to the international dialogue on human rights. In the United States of America, youth under the age of 24 represent 40% of self-identified natives today, numbers that continue to grow as tribal communities become stronger, more self-determined, and provide more opportunities for their youth to contribute to the development of their nations. Yet historical trauma, chronically underfunded programs, ineffective policies, and failure to meet trust responsibilities and treaty responsibilities to tribes have all contributed to negative health, education, and economic disparities for American Indian and Alaska Native youth. The Declaration provides the tools to change this narrative. Tribal nations have been working to incorporate the Declaration into their own tribal constitutions, statutes, and legal systems to better protect the human rights of their own citizens. And we see more and more Indigenous youth stepping forward to better understand the international frameworks to strengthen their advocacy efforts and fight for the survival of their tribal nations, like efforts to oppose construction of the Dakota Access Pipeline at Standing Rock. So I want to acknowledge the youth in this room and around the world for their efforts. We should be supporting and respecting these young leaders, including by providing the necessary seat at the table for their governments at the United Nations. The 2014 World Conference on Indigenous Peoples presented a rare opportunity to implement the Declaration, to make decisions that would affect positive changes in the lives of Indigenous peoples and to curtail rights violations. Together with over 150 tribal nations and organizations, the Indian Law Resource Center advocated for concrete steps the UN could take to achieve the objectives of the Declaration. The outcome document of the World Conference reflected these proposals and achieved two important things. First, it recommitted member states to the rights of Indigenous peoples. And second, it resulted in new commitments to establish international mechanisms that would further implement the Declaration. One such mechanism is the expert mechanism on the rights of Indigenous peoples, which the Council decided to strengthen last year, providing it with new authority to address human rights violations. A declaration will not go very far unless it has a serious implementing and monitoring body. This is generally understood in the UN system. The mechanism, the expert mechanism, can become the credible, independent body that can monitor and report on states' compliance with the Declaration and can engage with local actors to ensure recommendations by international bodies and mechanisms are respected and fulfilled. The expert mechanism can issue status reports and studies on Indigenous peoples' rights globally and on good practices regarding efforts to achieve the goals identified in the Declaration based on information and recommendations received from member states, Indigenous peoples, and others. The body can report to the Council the necessary facts and information to respond seriously and effectively to rights violations and implementation failures. Beyond reporting, the body can gather, seek, and disseminate information about implementation and violations of Indigenous rights by participating in regional or national gatherings of Indigenous leaders and by actively seeking information from Indigenous communities. The mechanism can provide advice to member states and Indigenous peoples about technical matters, like how states can develop new laws to protect Indigenous rights or to eliminate harmful elements already in domestic laws. Elements like those that leave Indigenous lands and resources without protection, or Indigenous women and girls without justice when they are targeted for sexual assault, violence, or trafficking. The mechanism is also able to assist states with implementation of existing recommendations of treaty bodies and those of the Universal Periodic Review, and to coordinate its work with other UN bodies and special procedures. Such collaboration is critical. The Special Rapporteur on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples is just one person. The expert mechanism is now 7, and can provide the necessary support to work across UN agencies and bodies to bring Indigenous rights to full fruition, and to translate its mandate into institutional practices and procedures that will improve the lives of Indigenous peoples and advance the objectives of the Declaration at the international level. To be successful, the mechanism will need adequate capacity, and it will need the support of member states, this Human Rights Council, and of Indigenous peoples. The grave and urgent situation of Indigenous peoples demands UN attention. Implementation of the Declaration and the outcome document are an ongoing challenge that will take time. It is the work of generations, and it is essential the information and tools to continue the work are passed on to our youth. Indigenous youth, along with their leaders, must be aware of their rights, educated about the international human rights system, and trained to utilize opportunities like those provided by the World Conference, to implement their rights. The Declaration has empowered Indigenous peoples to speak out and to stand up, and it has provided a platform for Indigenous peoples to come together to call for much-needed changes in the laws and policies and institutional practices and behaviors that have hindered and discriminated against Indigenous peoples for far too long. Let us work together to ensure the principles and purposes of the Declaration and the UN Charter are met, and that all peoples are entitled to the equal protection of international law. Nyawakoa, thank you for your attention.